Welcome to the lesson for research methods in social psychology. To work through this lesson, you're going to need your social psychology booklets starting from page 63. So in terms of content then for your methodology attached to social psychology, you can see your objectives on page 63 there. We will be looking at self-reporting data, so what this is and how it takes place. So that includes questionnaires and interviews and the different types of questions that can be asked. So the differences between unstructured, semi-structured and structured interviews, and then the use of open and closed questions, which include ranked scale questions and Likert scales. There'll be a little bit of a recap on alternate hypotheses. If you remember from cognitive psychology, this is your hypothesis. It's called an alternate hypothesis because you're not using an experimental method. We're also going to have a look at sampling techniques and the differences between random, stratified, volunteer and opportunity sampling. We're also going to have a look at the difference between qualitative and quantitative data, so we're going to start off with that. Within your analysis of quantitative data, this also includes some of the math skills. So that's calculating your measures of central tendency, which are your mean, median and mode, the use of frequency tables, presentation of data using bar charts, and we're also going to have a recap on measures of dispersion. So we have done a standard deviation in the cognitive practical, we've also done a range, so that's also included in social psychology. We're going to have a look at how you would analyse qualitative data using the methodology of a thematic analysis. And you also need to be able to have a look back and recap at your BPS Code of Ethics and Conduct. So in terms of recap in content that we have already looked at, British Psychological Society Code of Ethics is included in social psychology as well as in all other aspects of psychology. You do have some recap information about this. So you will need the work that you did first of all looking at the BPS Code of Ethics early on when we looked at this in cognitive psychology. And also if you go through your method section to page 92, 93 and 94, you've got a breakdown of the key features of the BPS Code of Ethics and Conduct. So you will need to recap back through that. I know we've looked at that quite a bit as well when we've done Milgram and his research. You will also need to recap on your math skills. So there are some videos up on Teams for how to calculate a mean, median and mode if you need to recap on that. Also frequency tables are up there. And bar charts, if you go back to the very start where we did the baseline maths test, you can have a look at how bar chart can be constructed. And also go back to how you calculate a range and a standard deviation from your cognitive practical. There are also some videos up on Teams on those if you also need to recap there. So we're going to have a look first of all at what we mean by self-reported data. Self-reported data is how individuals report their own views, feelings, thoughts and beliefs. So they do that through questionnaires and interviews. So if you look on page 64, it goes through the issues of self-report data. So a self-report is any test or measure or a social survey that relies on the individual reporting their own thoughts and feelings. It's gathered typically from questionnaires. They can be paper and pencils, traditional style. They can be in electronic format with the rise of social media. You can send out online resources, and sometimes they're done through various methods of interviews. Self-report data is usually the easiest and fastest way to collect data, especially with the ability to send them out online. And it can be used to collect both types of data, so you can get quantitative and qualitative data from the use of self-reports. One of the problems with self-report data is it can be subject to what we call social desirability bias. Now, this is where people want to seem good, and what they do is they answer questions in a way that puts them in a positive light rather than being truthful and honest, which has an impact on the validity. And also there are problems of leading questions in interviews and sometimes in questionnaires where the researcher has included terminology, words and phrases that would lead the respondent into answering in a particular way. Sometimes this is done intentionally, but most of the time it can be done unintentionally by a researcher, which raises the importance of pilot studies and getting other people to check your questions. So when using self-report data, it's useful to use a variety of question types, open and closed-ended questions, and make sure that someone checks questionnaires and does a pilot study to make sure there are no leading questions that can sort of take participants down a particular route. You've also got to make sure questions are relevant to the topic and that they're easily understood by the participants, so you don't use any complicated terminology, specific language that is only understood by those who may have studied a particular topic and are already aware of it. So in the box on page 64, you've got advantages and disadvantages of self-report data overall. So if you can pause the video and just make a note of the advantages and disadvantages. So in terms of advantages, you generally have quite good validity. It's asking people directly to get their own opinions, their own perspectives and their values and beliefs. This is stronger if you have open-ended questions where they can expand on their answers than if you have closed questions. You can gather lots of qualitative and quantitative data, and it's usually quite quick and cheap. You can therefore target large sample groups to reduce the impact of anomalies, and you can try and target lots of different groups to make your sample a bit more representative. Questionnaires can obviously be easily replicated. That makes them reliable because you can do the same questionnaire over and over again. And again, with some forms of interviews, so particularly structured interview, you can replicate those and again increase the reliability and check the findings of your study. Closed questions are quantifiable, so you can turn the selected answers from the options into quantitative data, which can therefore be summarised in tables, graphs, easily compared. You can look for trends in particular aspects of the data, and you can also use statistical assessments and tests to see if your data is significant. Some of the disadvantages of self-report data: if you're providing fixed choice questions, it lacks flexibility and forces people to answer. This gives a lower validity because they're not giving their full and detailed opinions. They can't explain why they picked a particular answer. So this is a particular problem with structured interviews and closed-ended questions. Social desirability, as we've mentioned, people tend to give answers that they think make them look good rather than being honest and true. Acquiescence. So this is in terms of whether people just have limited options. So if they are only able to give things like yes and no answers, people tend to just acquit their responses and they just answer yes more than they do no. So they tend to just be agreeable. Most people tend to want to agree with statements, and therefore you need to be able to counterbalance your questions, particularly in closed answer questions, in order to have different versions of the same question and try and reduce this tendency to just agree as opposed to really think about the answer. If you're setting closed questions in questionnaires or structured interviews, you've given a fixed response that they can pick from. People may not want to pick one of those responses, but there is a tendency to pick one anyway, so it might not actually be what they generally believe. Questions may be misunderstood, which lowers the reliability. They're not really answering what they're supposed to be answering. This tends to take place if you're using complicated terminology and phrases and language that you have to be a specialist to understand. And you can suffer from a low response rate if people don't actually answer the question, if they can't be bothered, they don't have time, you're not stood over them making them do it, particularly if you send it out online, and therefore some people may just ignore any emails or links and not actually bother to fill in the questionnaires. Okay, so when it comes to the way in which questionnaires and interviews can be structured, you've got two different types here. So you've got structured, which is using a very specific set of questions rather than a general set of aims. So this is very focused. It's most likely to take place in a questionnaire where you're providing closed-ended questions with yes, no, maybe options or levels of agreement. But you can do it in an interview if you're using a preset group of questions, which you tend to do over the phone, where you might ask somebody verbally to select a particular closed answer. Unstructured tend to be quite difficult to do in questionnaires. Often the questions are preset in a questionnaire, so whilst you can have open questions that allow a slightly more unstructured response, the question is still fixed and already structured. So it poses some difficulties if you're doing a questionnaire, but if you're doing an interview, an unstructured interview would be talking very openly, so you might have a particular question that you ask, and then depending on what the respondent has said to you, you may discuss it in a more open, chatty, kind of light and less formal sort of way. Okay, so on page 65 of your booklet, you've got some bullet points which give you a rough guideline as to how you would design self-report data gathering techniques, whether that's a questionnaire or an interview. This takes you through from how you would design the questions, so avoiding those ambiguous, complex, detailed questions with sort of complicated terminology, using a pilot study right through to checking for bias and social desirability. So if you can pause the video and read through those bullet points, underneath you've got a little post-it note space, so if you can summarise the key features of setting up and designing self-report gathering techniques, and then restart the video when you're done. One of the main issues that you need to have a think about when you're looking at self-report data and other data that's gathered in psychology is the issue of objectivity versus subjectivity. So being subjective is when you consider something from your own point of view, and objectivity is when you are able to see what's actually there without bias, so data that can be interpreted without your own thoughts and feelings influencing the way in which you see responses. When it comes to surveying people, we're talking about asking them about their views, how they've experienced something, their own opinions. So in terms of methodology, self-report data is always asking someone for their own subjective data. So it becomes subjective from the very outset, regardless of whether you try not to have any experimental bias. People are describing things from their own point of view. So you're only ever going to get people's opinions and feelings. Now, these are particularly important in social psychology. If you want to know why somebody might feel prejudiced or why somebody may obey, you do want their opinions and feelings, but you always do have to bear in mind, alongside social desirability, that it is a subjective thought process that an individual has gone through. So if you can read the remaining information on page 66 there, and then I want you to have a go in the space provided at the bottom of page 66 at answering the question that's in front of you on the screen. So explain whether or not subjectivity should be considered a weakness of social psychology research. What I would like you to do in planning out and answering this question is, first of all, pick apart the question. So we've got 4 marks, 2 AO1, 2 AO3. The AO1 marks are for your understanding of what subjectivity is and therefore what objectivity is. And then your AO3 is for developing this within the context of social psychology. So you do need to make links to topical areas within the subject. So you may be talking about subjectivity being totally fine if you want to know why somebody may feel prejudiced towards another person. It therefore gives you that qualitative insight into their thoughts and feelings, which is actually what you're looking for in social psychology. But you also do need to do that whether or not. So it's an argument, so you have to provide the opposite point of view. So that would be the objective side, and the fact that actually you do need to be able to measure things like trends in prejudice, trends in obedience, whether people are still likely to obey and stuff like that. And therefore you do need to have some sort of objective, quantifiable data that you could actually use in social psychology to look at changes and patterns in human behaviour. So that's kind of the route you're going down. So AO1, is it subjective? Why is it subjective? How is it subjective? And, you know, AO3, this is okay because. And then AO1, It shouldn't be subjective, it should be objective. Objectivity is this, and then your AO3, this is why it's a weakness to not be objective, because actually objectivity gives us a better perspective. So pause the video, have a little go at that, putting it together, and once you're done, restart the video. So before we get into questionnaires and interviews and thematic analysis in more detail, we're going to have a look at the differences between quantitative and qualitative data. So we're going to start with quantitative and look at the data collection methods and analysis, and then some evaluations. So if you look at the information on page 67 there, quantitative research is defined as research which performs mathematical modelling. So it is any form of research that allows you to gather numerical, quantifiable data, and that allows you then to do statistical tests, and then you can look at sort of cause and effect, you can look at significance of data, and so on. So quantitative methods include experimental methods, closed-ended questionnaires, psychometric testing, structured observations, and so on. And they provide us information that is sort of easy to analyse statistically. Not that statistics are necessarily easy to do, but you do not need to convert data to conduct that analysis. So the data that you gather, the raw data, the measures of your dependent variables and the answers to questions, are easy to analyse in the sense that they already come in a numerical format. Quantitative methods are generally associated more with scientific and experimental approaches in psychology, but they are criticised because they don't provide an in-depth description of the how or the why or the reasons for example, giving answers to questionnaires, why people chose things and what people think and feel, which is obviously a big part of psychology research. So when we're looking at quantitative data, it's also really important that you understand the two different types of data. So you've got continuous data and discrete data. This feeds in to your mathematical understanding. Discrete data, remember, is the data that you would plot into a bar chart. Continuous data is the data that you would plot into a histogram. Equally, with continuous and discrete data, you would be using this to inform the nature of the measure of dispersion that you would be taking. So for continuous data, you tend to calculate the mean, and with discrete data, you're more likely to calculate something like the median or the mode. So any counts that are discrete, so the number of boys, the number of words recalled, all right, they tend to be discrete data using bar charts and mode and median. And then any measurements tend to be continuous, so how long it takes to do something, how fast something takes place, any sort of measure of time, temperature and so on is continuous. So this, you would use a histogram, and you would calculate the mean more often than the other two. Discrete data can't be made more precise. So one of the things with discrete data is that you can't get any more depth and detail, whereas actually if you take continuous data, for example, the measurement of time, so say you recorded somebody's response time in seconds, you can turn that into discrete data and you can categorise people as fast and slow, for example. So you can turn that into discrete data. So continuous is more a precise measure, discrete is a less precise measure. So whilst we're on that, it might be worth stopping and just jotting down in your booklets some extra examples of each type of data. So in terms of quantitative data, one of the benefits is that we can use statistics and statistical tests to use that data to help us with decision making, looking for patterns, trends and significance. It allows us to look for relationships, how strong those relationships are, and the connections between different aspects of the mathematical numerical data that you've gathered. Now, statistics come in two forms. They can be descriptive statistics or inferential statistics. Descriptive descriptive statistics allow you to summarise your data. So these are things like your mean, median and mode. You can use those to provide a summary, to sort of show a couple of basic points about your data, and to describe what your data is doing, what it's showing us, and so on. Inferential statistics are used to determine whether your data is actually significant. Is it a significant test of the manipulation of your independent variables? So inferential statistics are the statistical tests that we do across psychology. You've already done a Wilcoxon test in your cognitive practical. You've then got chi-squared, Mann-Whitney, and the Spearman's test that we'll look at as we go through the rest of the course. This allows us to determine whether the data we've got actually means anything. Does it really show us that our experiment or our questionnaire is giving us useful, important data? So that's why we do statistical testing. Obviously, in quantitative research, we try and control all the extraneous variables, and we aim for that sort of sense of objectivity. And so it's designed really to make sure that we can accept or reject our hypothesis, and that we can be really, really specific with that IV and DV and all of those controls. And then we can make that judgment of whether the data that we've gathered has significance through inferential statistics, and just see whether or not what we've actually conducted our experiment or our questionnaire or our interview or observation on is actually a reliable cause and effect. So at the bottom of page 67, you'll see you've got 5 little boxes there. I'd like you to come up with some ideas about what sort of quantitative data you could gather from an investigation. Now, this can be related to social, but you can also relate this to any other aspect of psychology. So what quantitative data would you gather? What would you measure numerically in any aspect of social psychology or cognitive psychology? So, for example, you might want to count the level of voltage that someone would go up to when following the instructions of an authority figure. All right, so you would count voltage up to 450 volts like Milgram did. You can't write that one down, that's my example, but any dependent variable that is measured numerically, or that you could measure numerically in social psychology or cognitive if you find that easier, can you please jot down some ideas? You can buddy up and talk to somebody about this, and just pause the video and then restart when you've got some ideas down. So that brings you to your evaluations of quantitative data, which can be found on page 68. If you can have a look through those, what I would like you to do is a post-it note summary of the strengths, and then a post-it note size summary of the weaknesses. So go through, highlight the key points, key features and most important ideas, and then jot those down on quick summary pages, and then stick those into your booklet. Once you're done with that, restart the lesson. Okay, so we're now going to move on to qualitative data and how we go about collecting and analysing qualitative data. So you're going to need your booklets open at page 69 and 70. So qualitative data is quite different to quantitative. It's written and detailed, in-depth information. So qualitative data describes meanings, it describes experiences, why people feel the way they do, what people's feelings are, and it is expressed usually in an extended written kind of response to a questionnaire with open questions, or semi-structured and unstructured interviews. You also gather qualitative data in things like case studies. So if you think of the case of HM back in cognitive, you will have diaries and detailed written narrative observations of the things that he could and couldn't remember, how he felt, and so on. So qualitative data is all about describing the meaning, the depth, the detail, rather than looking at statistical or numerical trends. So one of the things with qualitative methods is they have reduced reliability. They are very, very subjective, they're very personalised, they're independent individual opinions, and therefore the reliability reduces. However, as with any sort of reduction in reliability, it's usually countered by an increase in validity. So you've got that rich, detailed and in-depth description. So qualitative researchers study things usually in the natural settings, and what they do is they attempt to make sense of phenomena in terms of what it means to people. So how and why has this taken place? How does that make you feel? What is your opinion on this? Why do you think that? Why would you be prejudiced towards this particular group of individuals? Why would you obey this particular authority figure? So it brings it in to far more individualised data. One of the issues with that is you can't then extrapolate from that and necessarily generalise to a wider population, and it is also very, very subjective. So you don't have an objective categorical measure, and therefore it can't be replicated in that sense. However, despite the lack of replication, the ultimate aim of qualitative research anyway is to just understand the social reality of people. So the individuals, different groups, why have you formed an identity with that group? How does that group make you feel? And different cultural aspects. So you can take a perspective from the culture in which you're investigating something like prejudice or obedience, and understand what it feels like to live in that culture, to experience that culture or that group for the individual. So qualitative research involves the researchers sort of immersing themselves in the natural experiences in the fields in which the participants live and interact and so on. They don't use what we call contrived experimental methods, so they're not artificial, it's not structured, it's not controlled, and nothing becomes predefined or taken for granted. So it allows that sort of natural flow of seeing what is genuinely happening and talking to people about the how and the why. It allows the participants to speak for themselves, and this works particularly well with vulnerable groups and marginalised groups. So if you're looking at something like prejudice, it allows you to talk to the marginalised groups of people, whether that is women who've experienced sexism, whether it is ethnic minorities who've experienced racism, whether it is homosexual groups who've experienced homophobia, and it allows you to understand their perspective from the real world in which they've interacted and experienced prejudice. So it's worth remembering that although it's not a reliable, retestable method, the balance that you do need to get in something like research into prejudice for social psychology is that, yes, you may want to look at objective, quantitative trends, but equally one of the important things is knowing how does that make people feel? What are people's experiences? Why do people feel that particular way towards another group, so that you can begin to use the psychology understanding to address those issues rather than just explain them. So when it comes to qualitative research, it tends to be exploratory. What you quite often find with large-scale research is that qualitative research comes first. So this might be part and parcel of doing a pilot study. It might be that a researcher goes out and undertakes qualitative data gathering to find out how and why a particular phenomenon exists, or get some ideas about how it works in a particular context. The study is able to evolve during the research, so it means that if you find something out that you didn't expect, you can carry on looking at that. You can look into that particular thing in much more detail. What it does is it then gives you a really substantial background context, and what happens usually is that from that position, people will then go on to undertake more quantitative data and try and track trends, objective measures, statistical patterns that help support these particular issues. When it comes to the self-report data that we're looking at in social psychology, a good example of qualitative research is the use of unstructured interviews. Now, this starts with open questions. You may have one or two planned out that you might want to talk about, but it allows the respondent to give depth and detail in their own way in answer to that question, and the researcher is then able to pick out from their answers something that they might find interesting. They can go into detail on something that one respondent says. The next person may not say anything like it, but they can find out about something different. So it's picking up and having that sort of more conversational level of an interview. The other benefit is that it can include more than just words or text. So photographs, videos, sound, all of those different things can be used within qualitative data. So, for example, if you're looking at, in social psychology, say you're looking at social identity theory, you want to know about people's identity, identification with particular groups, so stage 2 in social identity theory, you could look at photographs on Facebook and the changes in the way in which people present themselves. Photographs of people showing their allegiances to particular social groups, whether that's in football kits or particular clothing, sound recordings, so it can be listening to music, the messages that are sort of portrayed in different types of music and the use of music in different cultures. So it allows you to look at a much broader aspect of human life than just testing very specific, measured, controlled, smaller variables. So at the bottom of page 69, you've got your 5 little boxes again. What I'd like you to do is think about what kinds of things you might gather as a psychology researcher. Obviously try and link to social psychology, but you can also link to other aspects of psychology. And what kind of things would you want to find out? So what kind of data might you want to gather from an investigation that is qualitative? So, for example, if we go to Milgram, and you can't steal this one and write it down, you've got to come up with your own, but it may be that you would want to ask people why they chose to stop obeying. How did they feel when they were told that they had to continue administering electric shocks? How did it make them feel when they thought somebody had gone quiet on the other side of the screen and, potentially was dead? So you'd want to talk about their emotions, their thoughts, and their experiences. So think about that in terms of wider issues of prejudice, obedience, bystander effect, for example. And you can also do some examples from cognitive if you want to. So, what's it feel like to experience something like amnesia or brain damage that limits your semantic or episodic memory formation. So think about those different aspects. So pause the video, have a think, you can buddy up and come up with some ideas and then restart when you're finished. Okay, so page 70, you've got some strengths and weaknesses of gathering qualitative data. Again, same task. What I'd like you to do is read through the strengths and the weaknesses, highlight the key points, underline the key terms, pick out the most important features. And for the strengths and for the weaknesses, write a post-it note summary for each one of those and stick them in your booklets on page 70. So we're going to have a look at comparing the nature of quantitative and qualitative data. What you may have noticed, hopefully, when you've gone through some of the strengths and weaknesses is the strength of quantitative tends to be the weakness of qualitative. So, for example, quantitative gives you objective, numerical, statistically analysable data. Qualitative gives you subjective, in-depth, non-numerical, unstatistical data. So the strength of one is generally the weakness of the other. So if you think about things like reliability, validity, sampling, so you can do quite a big quantitative social survey using a closed questionnaire, but you would have to have quite a small sample for in-depth interviews and things like that. So we're going to have a look at focusing on those comparisons between the two. This helps you with your evaluations of quant-qual data. It helps you with any questions where you're asked to compare on an exam paper. It should help you pick apart strengths and weaknesses of any unseen scenario material that you're presented with in an exam. It can help you with your evaluation points of any of your contemporary or classic studies. For example, you could take this back and do an evaluation of the fact that Milgram gathered quantitative data on obedience using electric faults. Why is that good? And then you can also talk about why that's bad, because he misses out that holistic qualitative data. So when you are looking through these comparisons, when you finish, you can go back to those big studies and start to bring in the extra strengths and weaknesses using your understanding of the nature of the data that they actually gathered. So when it comes to comparing quant and qual, they both have their strengths and weaknesses, and as a result, in reality, most psychologists tend to do both. So they tend to gather a combination of quant and qual data. Quite often, if you're doing a questionnaire, you'll have open and closed questions, and this allows psychology to be sort of less rigid in the type of method and data that it gathers, and it allows you to then sort of have both that reliable element of data and that valid representation of real life experience. So the data on page 71, you've got your quant qual, and you've got comparisons between the two. So you've got comparisons based on the purpose, approach, use of hypothesis, research setting, sampling, design and method, data collection strategy, data analysis and data interpretation. And you've got some information about qualitative and quantitative methods within that. What I would like you to do, using the space on page 72, is see if you can answer the compare question, right? So compare quantitative and qualitative data collection. So this is 6 marks. This would be incredibly, to be fair, incredibly rare on an actual exam to do 6 AO3 marks for a comparison. However, it is extremely beneficial for you to get used to that process of making those comparison points. And remember, you need similarities and differences. And that may well be quite difficult to pull together for quantitative and qualitative. You only need one of each, and then you can have whatever you like for the rest of the marks. But first of all, maybe think about a similarity between quantitative and qualitative data collection. You want to be thinking about structuring the questions in advance. So whether it's open or closed question, you still have to design it beforehand, and things like that. So think about similarity and then work through perhaps giving the rest as differences. Remember to use your connectives and the key sort of structures to show you're making a comparison. So saying things like quantitative data is or gathers, you know, objective measures, numerical, blah, blah, blah. However, qualitative is this. Using words like however, but, alternatively, those are the connectives that highlight to the examiner that you're doing a comparison answer. So have a go at that. Use the space on page 72, and that brings you to the end of the lesson reviewing quant and qual data.